services, interventions designed to change behavior or thoughts around criminal behavior is associated with reducing recidivism. And so just making the point that, and in the US, we have a long history of just sort of wanting to punish people. But if we really want to reduce recidivism and improve outcomes for youth, we need to make sure that we're providing effective interventions. The other reality, though, is that not all treatment is equally effective, that there are some studies, or rather some programs, that are significantly more effective than others. And so it's not enough just to say, let's put people into a treatment program or some sort of treatment intervention. We really need to make sure that those programs are designed in a way that is supported by the research. And so I want to spend this morning really talking to you about the risk need responsivity framework, or the R&R framework. My sense is that it's made its way to Chile and other countries in South America and Central America, at least somewhat, but I'm not sure that it's being fully implemented yet. So I just want to sort of talk through the principles, think about what this looks like in practice, and what that means for programs being designed and implemented in various jurisdictions. So we're going to talk about 4 principles specifically. To be honest, I think there are about 18 principles, depending on how you count, but I want to talk about these 4 primary ideas, which involve the risk principle and has implications for who we target for interventions, the need principle, which has implications for the type of treatment targets, the behaviors that we're focusing on, the responsivity principle, which has implications for how we go about providing services. And then finally, this idea of fidelity, or making sure that it's not just that we have a well-designed program, but also that that program is being delivered with integrity, that it's being delivered how indeed it was designed to be. And so we'll talk about each of those a little bit more. First, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when I'm using the term risk, because we can think about risk in a lot of different ways. There's the and in this way, we're talking specifically about the risk of recidivism. So the likelihood of getting into trouble again. So someone who is higher risk has a higher likelihood, a higher probability of recidivating or reoffending or getting into trouble, whereas someone who is lower risk has a lower probability. This is not to say that all high-risk people will reoffend. We're thankfully not that good at prediction. And at the same time, the reality is, among low-risk people, 1 or 2, 10% maybe, might reoffend. And so these aren't exact definitions, they're really just probabilities, or the propensity of reoffending, and it's on a continuum then of low to high risk. I think when we talk about risk, some people think about, risk of teen pregnancy, or risk of maybe dropping out of school, and just focusing here that we're really specifically talking about the risk of recidivism. So within that context, then, the risk principle says that we need to match the level of service and supervision to the level of risk. What this means is that for youth that are identified as higher risk, they have a higher probability of reoffending, of getting into trouble again, they should receive more intensive services. They should receive more intensive supervision. And for low risk youth, those youth that are assessed as having a low probability of reoffending, we really should provide minimal, if any, service to those individuals. Ideally, we would sort of triage those low risk youth out of the juvenile and criminal justice systems and sort of just leave them alone. And with the idea that they should correct their behavior on their own. What the research tells us consistently is that when we overserve low-risk youth or low-risk individuals, we can do harm. And we see an example of this here. These are results from a study done by my colleagues at the University of Cincinnati, Chris Lowenkamp and Ed Latessa. For this study, they were interested in looking at the effectiveness of programs for youth. They followed close to 15,000 juveniles for a period of 2 years. And these juveniles received services in one of about 350 different types of programs. And so within that, there were community-based programs, residential programs, and then institutional programs, detention or youth prisons. And part of what they looked at was the outcomes of these youth by setting and risk level. For this study, recidivism was defined as a new conviction over a 2-year period. And what we see here is this, and I apologize, I realized almost all of my bars are blue, but this sort of medium shade of blue represents low-risk youth, youth that have a low likelihood of reoffending. And when they were served in the community, they had an 8% recidivism rate. 8% were reconvicted in that 2-year period. When low-risk youth were served in residential settings, they had a 20% recidivism rate. These are youth that had the same likelihood of reoffending, the same probability of reoffending, but putting them into that increased level of supervision, the increased level of service drove recidivism rates up, which is obviously not what we want to do, right? And we spent money to do this. So we're using resources ineffectively and doing harm to youth. You'll notice that there were no low-risk youth in the institution, and that's because this particular state precludes low-risk youth from being institutionalized. But I think these findings, really speak to the need to keep low-risk youth at home. We can look at the results also for the very high risk. And here we see that very high risk in the youth in the community had a 41% recidivism rate compared to 29% in residential settings and 30% in institutional settings. And so just as overserving youth, low-risk youth can do harm, underserving high-risk youth can equally do harm. And so we just really want to be mindful of the types of decisions that we're making about where we place youth and the type of services that we're providing them so that we're matching them appropriately. I also just want to point out that among our high risk, they performed pretty much the same across community, residential, and institutional settings. And so I think the takeaway from this is that even among our high-risk youth, we don't automatically want to incarcerate them or put them into residential settings. I think that in the US at least, the idea of incarceration has sort of been the default option for a number of years. And what these results tell us is that we don't have to do that. That should only be when necessary and should be maybe sort of more the exception than the rule. So what this means then is that we need to have risk assessments. If we want to match the level of service to the level of risk, we need to know what someone's probability of reoffending is. And so there are a number of standardized risk assessments that have been developed and used throughout the US, Canada, and many, many other countries, including some in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what these instruments tend to have in common is that they are largely based on these central 8 risk factors, which have been identified by Andrews and Bonta and many other researchers. And so just briefly, regardless of the exact tool that you're using, you should have a risk assessment tool that looks at these types of factors. So assesses for the presence of antisocial attitudes or thoughts that are supportive of criminal behavior. If I don't think that it's a problem to use violence when I feel disrespected, then I'm going to use violence when I feel disrespected. Or if I think that it's okay to use drugs because everyone does it, then I'm likely to continue using drugs. Our assessments should be looking for the type of companions that someone has. Do they have antisocial or delinquent and criminal peers, or do they have peers that are good influences? If you have teenagers, you tend to want them to spend time with the good kids, and that's because the good kids will have a good influence. We don't want them to spend time with the kids that are in trouble because those kids, those youth, tend to have negative influences. We want to make sure that we're looking at antisocial personality characteristics. And I'm not talking about antisocial disorder or antisocial personality disorder, but rather characteristics associated with recidivism. So things like having low self-control, being impulsive, engaging in risk-seeking behaviors, having poor decision-making skills, sort of those personality traits that define how we interact with our environment. And what we know is when people have some of these personality traits, particularly coupled with antisocial peers or antisocial attitudes, the risk of reoffending goes up. Of course, we know that substance use disorder is associated with crime and recidivism, so we want to be attentive to that, as well as family dynamics. Youth do better when they have supportive families, caring families that reinforce positive behaviors. And so if there's a lot of conflict in the family or parents maybe aren't doing such a great job of parenting, we want to work on those types of things. We know from the research that youth that get into trouble at an earlier age are more likely to continue getting into trouble, that they tend to sort of miss out on developing some of those pro-social skills, coping skills. And so we need to be attentive to that. Being involved in educational settings, going to school is a protective factor. So we want to make sure that we're assessing for their engagement in school, both are they going to school, but also how are they doing at school? And then finally, we want to make sure that we're looking at how people use their free time. Are they using their free time in very passive, unconstructive ways that lead them to getting into trouble? Or are they using their free time in ways that sort of surrounds them with a number of positive influences? And so when we're thinking about providing effective services, we want to make sure that we have an assessment in place that is covering these types of factors. How these factors look might be a little bit different country to country, region to region, in terms of how we measure them, but the general ideas should hold true. Now, I recently, with my colleagues at John Jay, did a scan of the literature to look at the extent to which standardized risk assessments and risk and need assessments have been tested or implemented in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I know on a screen this is probably difficult to read, but this guide is available for free, and so happy to share the link if people are interested in it. But what we see is that some countries have done a lot of testing of various risk assessments. Chile, Peru, for example. Honduras has had a number of research studies there looking at the use of risk assessment. And so you sort of get the sense that the use of these tools is starting to happen in the region, but I don't think that it's widespread yet. And so I think we really need to be taking a closer look at how to implement and test these tools to make sure that programs have the correct information so that they can appropriately target the right youth. In addition to thinking about risk, we also want to make sure that we're adhering to the need principle. And the need principle says that we can reduce the likelihood of recidivism by assessing and targeting criminogenic needs, and that we do this with deliberate, structured interventions. What are criminogenic needs? Quite simply, they're dynamic risk factors. So those central 8 risk factors that can be changed are the things that we should be targeting with our interventions. If someone has a drug problem, we should be providing treatment focusing on reducing their drug use. If someone has impulsivity, low self-control, then we should be providing them interventions that are designed to increase their levels of self-control, increase perhaps their decision-making. And when we do that, we're reducing the likelihood, we're reducing the presence of those risk factors, which means reducing the likelihood of recidivism. Here we see some examples of criminogenic needs and what we call non-criminogenic needs. And so again, you see examples of criminogenic needs include things like improving problem-solving skills, anger management or emotional regulation skills, improving family functioning, reducing criminal thinking, changing those attitudes that are supportive of criminal behavior. So we should assess youth for their risk and needs and then make sure that our interventions are targeting those needs or dynamic risks that are present. We also see here non-criminogenic needs. And in both cases, these are just examples, not an all-inclusive list. But non-criminogenic needs are factors that might be important, right? If someone is struggling with mental health, if they have depression or anxiety, those are important things to be considering and to be addressing. But what the research tells us is that non-criminogenic means are not driving recidivism. And so what that means is that if we only focus on non-criminogenic needs, we're not likely to change recidivism. We're not likely to change those outcomes. Now, for those low-risk youth, perhaps targeting mental health. If we have a low-risk youth who has depression, and we should divert them out of the system and make them referrals for mental health treatment. And that's probably all we need to do. But when we're talking about higher risk youth, those youth that have a higher likelihood of reoffending, if all we target is mental health or depression or physical activity, we're missing out on their criminogenic needs. And so what we're doing is maybe making them healthier in some ways, which is good, but we're not addressing the factors that are driving their likelihood of recidivism. And so we shouldn't really expect to see changes then in their long-term behavior. And here we see results from a study done by Paul Gendreau and his colleagues that were looking at the density of treatment targets. And so, the truth is, especially in residential and institutional settings, that we do target some non-criminogenic needs, and the same in the community. But the priority, the emphasis should be on those criminogenic needs. And here in this study, this is a meta-analysis, when programs targeted at least 4 to 6 more criminogenic needs, so the balance was heavily weighted towards criminogenic needs, they reduced recidivism an average of 31%. When the balance was more even of criminogenic to non-criminogenic needs, there was limited reduction in recidivism. And in fact, the average effect was 0. And so the point is, our focus should be on criminogenic needs because those are the needs, those are the factors that are driving the likelihood of recidivism. I think what happens is we have a tendency to focus on general well-being, as we should, but we do that at the exclusion of these other very important factors. And so really thinking about how you balance and prioritize case plans around these need areas. So risk tells us who to target, higher risk youth. Need tells us what, right? We need to target these criminogenic needs. The responsivity principle then tells us how to go about doing this. And responsivity is really about acknowledging that people respond to interventions differently. We're all unique. We all have individual styles, individual preferences, and we want to make sure that we're matching people to services that are best suited to them. If you've ever tried to put a square peg into a round hole, you know it doesn't work very well. And yet we do that a lot of times with youth, right? We put them into sort of a one-size-fits-all group, and it's not always the best match for them. And so responsivity is saying we need to be attentive to these individual differences and making sure that we're removing or taking away any barriers to being successful in a treatment setting. When we talk about responsivity, we can talk about both general responsivity and specific responsivity. General responsivity is really about the treatment approach that we should be using. And the research consistently tells us that behavioral and cognitive behavioral techniques are more effective than other approaches when we're trying to change behavior. And this is true not just for trying to change criminal behavior, but really any type of behavior. If you have tried to quit smoking, if you have tried to lose weight, behavioral programs are more effective at bringing about change and allowing for that change to sustain itself. And we'll talk in just a second a little bit more about what that means or what that looks like in practice. In addition to making sure that we have an effective treatment approach in place, we also want to make sure that we're utilizing core correctional practices. So a lot of times when I work with agencies, with a probation agency, for example, they refer someone to a treatment agency. And so you have your probation officer and your treatment group. And the treatment group maybe is doing behavioral types of techniques. But the truth is the probation officer also has a lot of influence on the individual, on the youth being served. And so we want to make sure that everyone, all criminal justice actors or juvenile justice actors that a youth comes into contact with is using core correctional practices, interacting with youth in a way that has been found to be effective. So that means things like building a therapeutic alliance, working collaboratively with youth. It means teaching problem-solving skills so that youth are empowered to have the ability to solve a problem or sort of manage risky situations, those situations where they might be more likely to get into trouble again. Core correctional practices includes the use of reinforcers and punishers to help shape behavior. It's not just punishment, right? But how do we reinforce new behaviors so that people are more likely to use those again? And of course, making sure that officers and staff are using their authority effectively, and that when they do need to sanction or indicate disapproval, that they do so in an effective manner, right? There's a lot of research talking about how to interact with youth and people in the justice system. And so my point here is that it's not just the program itself, but it's also the types of skills and characteristics that our staff have and possess that matters when we're talking about reducing recidivism. When I talk about behavioral programs, I'm specifically talking about very active, present focus types of programs. So when I go and observe groups, a lot of times I see a bunch of kids sitting in a circle talking about hypothetical situations, right? Well, I got into trouble this one time because, Juan came up and he offered me drugs and I didn't really want to do it, but I didn't know how to say no. So we just went and partied. And then there's this discussion about, well, what would you do next time? The problem is those discussions, those hypotheticals, don't teach people the actual skills that they need to manage these high-risk situations, to manage situations, people, places, or things where they're more likely to get into trouble. Behavioral programs are really about focusing on the risk factors, the lack of coping skills here and now, and providing people concrete skills that they can apply to these different situations. And so they focus on the here and now, not the past. They're very individualized in the sense that we practice different scenarios that are specific to that individual. Behavioral programs use a lot of, as I said, practice, right? So we introduce perhaps the skill of deciding how to say no. And we walk through the steps of what is associated with making that decision, right? First, we have to recognize it's a problem for us. We have to make the decision, which means identifying consequences of if I do this or if I don't, and then make the decision that I want to say no, and then actually say no. So there's a number of different steps that go along with that. And a behavioral program is going to have a facilitator that models those different steps for the youth. They sort of show them, right? They demonstrate it for them. And then each youth has a chance to practice those different steps. And each youth can practice those different steps in scenarios that are real for them. And then they can practice it again. And we can make it increasingly more difficult, and we can have them practice when they're back home or in the community. And so in doing this, we're not just talking hypothetically, how would you handle a situation, but we're providing real concrete skills that are increasingly getting more difficult, which means they're increasingly mimicking reality and becoming internalized, that then they can use. The nice thing about behavioral programs is that they're relatively brief. The truth is, we don't have 3 or 4 years to work with youth to try and change their behavior. But a good behavioral program, we can, with high-risk youth, maybe 6 or 9 months and see some real change in that individual. And they tend to be manualized, which means that regardless of who the facilitator is, we're all providing the same type of service, the same intervention, and assuming it's done with fidelity, which means that it's not a luck of the draw on whether or not I get a really skilled therapist or not, right? All of my therapists should be skilled. They should all be trained on the curriculum in delivering the same type of intervention. And so this type of approach to treatment improves outcomes consistently. And so I'll show you a slide about that in just a second. So general responsivity is sort of the big picture. And then we have specific responsivity, which really now is about the individual. With specific responsivity, we can talk about both internal factors and external factors. And remember, these are factors that might make it difficult for someone to be successful in an intervention. Addressing these factors is not thought to directly impact recidivism, but rather it increases the likelihood that someone can complete a group, complete an intervention. And we know that if someone successfully completes an intervention, they're also more likely to be successful after that intervention. So examples of internal factors include things like cognitive abilities, to be honest, some curricula, some cognitive behavioral curriculums are quite abstract. And if you have someone who has limited cognitive functioning, they might not do very well in that type of group. And so we would want to match them accordingly, right? We might want to think about issues of literacy. There are some curricula that require a lot of reading and writing. And if you have someone who doesn't read or write very well, then they're not going to do very well in that group unless we make adaptations for them. We can think about issues of age. Again, if you have teenagers, you probably don't want your 12-year-old hanging out with 18-year-olds, simply because we know those 18-year-olds can be a bad influence on the 12-year-olds, and their life experiences are vastly different. So all of these are factors that we want to take into consideration as we're assigning people to facilitators and to groups. We want to make sure that we're matching the individual needs of someone, their individual responsivity factors, with the type of service that they're receiving. We also want to be attentive to these external factors, right? Things that are sort of outside the control or direct control of the individual. So things like transportation. I live in New York City. Depending on where I'm trying to go, it could take me an hour and a half to get someplace. And if we refer someone to a group that takes them an hour and a half and 2 buses, and they're not super motivated, they're probably not going to show up. And so we want to be mindful of those issues, things like transportation, things like homelessness. It's hard to think about changing behavior when you don't have a safe, secure space to live. And so if we're working with youth that are homeless, or food insecure, we want to make sure that those needs are being met so then they can be successful in those group interventions. And you see here, I also have factors like gang affiliation and family support, which overlap with some of our risk factors. But thinking about how, gang affiliation or limited family support can have a negative impact on our ability to do well in a group setting. So let's say I'm super motivated to change my behavior and I really, really want to do good, but I get home and my family sort of undermines the changes that I'm trying to make, or sort of punishes me for trying to make those changes. We need to be attentive to those issues. So general responsivity is about the type of treatment using behavioral approaches, and specific responsivity is really about those individual differences and how we need to address them to allow people to focus on the treatment, on the intervention itself. There's been a lot of research done around the effectiveness of behavioral interventions, general responsivity, and here we see results from another meta-analysis where behavioral interventions have on average a 29% reduction in recidivism, whereas non-behavioral interventions, so educational, psychoeducational, sort of client-centered process groups, can reduce recidivism, but only here by about 7%. And so if we have to choose the nature of our intervention, we should choose those that are more likely to have greater reductions in recidivism. I should acknowledge we don't do as much, there hasn't been as much research on specific responsivity. There's more and more research coming out looking at issues of motivation. I'm really interested in the idea of language and how that impacts someone's ability to learn or not. But right now, most of the meta-analyses have really focused on behavioral interventions. And I think that's just because it's easier, quite frankly, to study. So how does this all come together? Well, there's been a lot of research looking at the effectiveness of programs based on the number of principles that they're adhering to. And this is results from just one study. This has been replicated time and time again with both adults and juveniles, men and women, and across different types of offender groups. And what we find is that programs that fail to adhere to any of these principles, on average, increase recidivism by about 2%. Programs that do at least one of the three tend to reduce recidivism, but I would say only marginally, right? Here, this outcome is a 2% reduction. Programs that do at least two, so they're adhering to risk, need, and or responsivity, at least two of those three, on average reduce recidivism about 18%, and those that are adhering to all three, so they're targeting higher risk people, they're targeting criminogenic needs, and they're using a behavioral approach, on average reduce recidivism in this study about 26%. There are some other studies where that number has gotten up to about 35, 36%, but either way, it's a pretty substantial decrease in recidivism and really speaks to the need to incorporate these ideas into practice. I want to acknowledge, though, that even a really well-designed program can fail if it's not being done well, if it's not being delivered as designed. And I mentioned the fidelity principle earlier, and here we see some results from a study that looked at this issue. There is a program called Functional Family Therapy. It's a well-supported curriculum. It's designed for juveniles, where facilitators or therapists work with a juvenile and their family to improve the functioning of that family unit, and has been found time and time again to reduce recidivism, to improve outcomes. There's a lot of training that goes into play with this curriculum, and a lot of oversight with this curriculum. Robert Bronowski in the state of Washington did a study looking at the effectiveness of FFT in Washington state when it was delivered with fidelity versus without. And so they rated all of the therapists, the facilitators delivering FFT, as delivering FFT competently or not, right? With fidelity or not. And here we see that when FFT was delivered with fidelity, there was a 38% reduction in recidivism. When it drifted, when facilitators sort of did their own thing, they didn't deliver the program as designed, recidivism rates went up. So even well-designed programs can fail if they're not done well. What this means then is we want to make sure that we're designing programs well and that they're being delivered well. And so we want to have checks in place, right? We want to have ways to monitor the quality of our programs. And programs can and should be doing this internally through quality assurance types of activities. They should be observing groups and providing feedback to staff. They should be providing supervision to staff and training. They should be monitoring assessments and case plans, making sure that all those are done with fidelity. It's also important, of course, that the program is designed with integrity and in alignment with the research. One way that we can measure this is through the correctional program checklist. I'll just talk about this very briefly, but the CPC is a tool that, again, was developed at Cincinnati. I'm definitely showing my bias here for UC. Was developed by my colleagues at Cincinnati, and is a way to measure how closely a program is in alignment with evidence-based practices, with the research. The checklist has about 80 different items. I think it's 78 different items across these 5 different domains. And most of these items are rated as a 0 or 1. You're doing it or not. And so within this checklist, we're looking really at 2 main ideas. One is capacity. Does this program have the capacity or the ability to deliver effective interventions? Is there strong leadership in place? Is there support from stakeholders? Was the program designed with a review of the literature in place? What about the staff? Are staff hired because they believe in the idea of change and they have the skills necessary to deliver interventions? Do they receive training? Do we make an investment in our staff? And do we provide feedback and coaching to them to help them continue to improve? We can look at issues of quality assurance. How well do programs monitor themselves? We know that drift will occur, but if we have monitoring and evaluation activities in place, then that drift can be caught and stopped and corrected. So we look at capacity, and then we also look at content. Is a program designed according to the R&R principles, and is it being delivered in that way? So what types of assessments are programs doing? Are they assessing for risk, need, and responsivity? Are they using validated tools to do so? And what is the nature of the treatment? Are they using the results of the assessments to drive treatment decisions, to drive case plans? And then are they using behavioral approaches? Are they working with family members and so forth? And so this is a tool that can be used to really give you a sense of the quality of a program. It's not the same as an evaluation, but it can be done in a day or two and give some immediate feedback to a program and some feedback about where it needs to make improvements, where it's doing well, and ultimately how likely it is to be effective. And so I just want to show you quickly some results of assessment. So these are sort of normed, the mean scores on the CPC across 670 different programs that have been assessed. This includes juvenile and adult programs, institutional and community-based programs, as well as residential. So sort of the whole gamut of programs. And so these, and I should also acknowledge that these programs are largely based in the US and Canada, some in Singapore, I think in Guam. I don't know of any programs to date that have been assessed in Latin America, so just acknowledging that. But here we see the overall results, and you'll see that overall, across these 660 programs, the average score or the average rating is about 49%, which is rated in the moderate adherence to EBP. So our programs are doing okay, but they should be doing a lot better. You'll also see that our scale is sort of shifted downward. If we're thinking about percentages and grading, and if I got a 65% in school, I would have been in a lot of trouble. But 65% here is considered to be very high adherence to evidence-based practice. And that's because we know that, you know, all of this research, putting in, it's not possible to do everything, right? That life is complicated, and we have judges that want certain things, and there are community factors that impact how we can do things. And so the scale is sort of adjusted to acknowledge for that. Nonetheless, we see overall programs score about 49%. They tend to do pretty well in terms of leadership and staff. Doing okay on assessment. I think assessment practices have really improved in the last 20 years in the US and Canada at least. Not doing so well in terms of quality assurance and treatment activities. In the US, many of our correctional programs historically have failed to monitor themselves. QA has been sort of an afterthought, and you see that reflected here. And in terms of treatment, I think this really just speaks to the challenges of implementing behaviorally based programs and implementing them well and being able to match. So we know that it's difficult in an area that we need to work with programs much more. When we look at the distribution of scores, so that overall rating, we see that about a third of the programs that have been assessed, again, in the 660 programs, have fallen into the high or very high adherence to evidence-based practices. About 40% fall into low adherence, and about 23-24% moderate adherence. You'll notice this line here, and what that line really represents is sort of a breaking point between programs that tend to be reducing recidivism and programs that are less likely to reduce recidivism. There aren't a lot of validation studies on the CPC or tools like it, simply because methodologically it gets a little bit complicated, because you need a number of programs that have been assessed, and you need outcomes and comparison groups. But nonetheless, the research does suggest that when programs score in the high and very high adherence categories, they're more likely to reduce recidivism. And so again, what this suggests to me is that in the US, at least, we have fairly high recidivism rates. And I would argue that at least some of that is a result of the quality of services that we're providing, that we need to do a better job in terms of our design of services and implementation of those services if we want to bring recidivism rates down. And here you just see, these are results from one of the studies that helped to shape the CPC. Programs that were rated as less than 60% on this measure of program integrity increased recidivism. Whereas once programs hit that 60% mark and above, recidivism rates came down. And so again, just really speaking to the importance of designing programs in a way that's consistent with the research if we want to reduce recidivism. And so the implications of all this to me are, I think, pretty clear. First, we need to make sure that we're using standardized assessments. If we want to be able to match youth to the right types of services, we need to know what their risk and need levels are. That's sort of the foundation. That's the first step of providing effective interventions. Secondly, we need to make sure that we're providing behavioral interventions, right? And this should be both in terms of how staff work with people, as well as how the groups are designed and delivered. If we want to change behavior, we need to use approaches that are most likely to do so. And thirdly, we really need to invest in our staff. Again, both our treatment staff as well as our correctional staff. We need to provide training to them. We need to provide support to them. We need to coach them so that they can work with youth in a way that is most likely to result in their success. And so I think it's safe to say changing behavior is difficult. It's not easy, but it is possible. And that to me is sort of the goal here, is that we, I believe, have a responsibility to improve our services so that we can serve youth better. And so we need to make sure that we are designing programs and delivering programs in a way that indeed are targeting those youth that are in need of the services, that we're identifying and targeting those criminogenic needs. And if your jurisdiction doesn't have services in place, that you're developing them, right? So that we can provide the needed services, that we're attentive to those individual differences and really take away the barriers to success, and that we're constantly monitoring and improving our services so that we can indeed have better outcomes for youth, because ultimately that means better outcomes for our communities, for youth, for their families, for all of us. And personally, I think that should always be our goal. So with that, I think I'm done, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias por su presentación, profesora Koetzle. Resulta muy pertinente. Recién a inicios de este año fue aprobado en la Cámara de Diputados el proyecto de ley que viene a reformar el nuevo servicio de responsabilidad penal, es Servicio Nacional de Reinserción Social Juvenil, ¿no? Que justamente tiene el desafío de poder abordar de manera efectiva a estos jóvenes. Y al respecto quisiéramos hacerle dos preguntas. Nos han llegado muchas preguntas, pero tenemos tiempo para resolver dos, ¿no? Entonces, partiremos con la primera, que considero que es muy importante, dado lo que nos ha mencionado respecto a adherencia, fidelidad, en la implementación, ¿no? No basta con tener un modelo sólido, sino que también es que se implemente de manera fiel. Y para ello quisiéramos saber cuáles son las competencias que se tienen que considerar en la formación de los recursos humanos que trabajan con adolescentes infractores, ¿no? ¿Qué experiencias positivas recomienda que miremos?
Okay. And so if I understood the question correctly, thinking about the issue of fidelity and staff training. And so what are the skills and values that we should be looking for in terms of hiring staff, and how do we best support them through training? Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. Great question, because, ultimately I think it's about us, right? And I think it's about how we work with youth. And so we want to select staff that believe change is possible, right? They're not just doing it for the money. I mean, the money's usually not that great, at least in the US, but they really believe in the idea of change and that there's hope for these youth. I think we want to hire staff that have good boundaries, right? So we want to develop alliances with the people that we're working with, but we also want to make sure that our roles are kept clear. And so having good boundaries is important. I think being firm but fair, right? And so not being quick to punish someone or respond punitively, but being predictable and consistent in how we work with people so that we can establish those boundaries, but treat everyone with dignity and respect and kindness is incredibly important. The research would say that people should have some education, right? Ideally, at least a couple of years of school and some exposure to this type of research, right? That they should have some knowledge about why they're doing the services that they're providing. In terms of training, what I would recommend to programs is that staff are trained before they start working with youth, right? Which seems common sense, but we don't do that in the US. We just sort of throw people into it. That they receive training on the theory of the program, on the assessment tools that they're using, on the curricula, but also that they have training specifically on how to use behavioral intervention so that they're very adept at being able to model appropriate behaviors and new skills, as well as provide reinforcement to youth as they're practicing through. And I think the important point for me is that it's not just that initial training, but it's ongoing support, so that there should be, whether it's weekly meetings or clinical supervision or booster sessions, where we're sort of constantly talking about skills and practice and building those, that it's a continuing process and not a one-time process. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Y la última pregunta que le quisiéramos hacer es saber qué opinión le merece el uso de los instrumentos de riesgo para determinar la pena, el castigo a imponer.
Mm-hmm. Great question, and one that we're definitely discussing a lot in the US these days, particularly because they're tools, they're instruments, and they're not immune to criticism, and they're certainly not perfect. So first, I want to say that assessment is not new, right? We assess youth all the time. What the research tells us is that structured approaches or standardized approaches to assessment is better than unstructured approaches. Okay, so making sure that we're all using the same approach to assessment and coming to the same conclusions is important, right? Versus sort of, I think it's all about drug use, and this person thinks it's all about family, and that person thinks it's all about friends, and we come up with very different ratings depending on our individual bias. Whether or not risk assessment should be used to decide the punishment, I think not. I think that as much as possible, we want to keep people with limited exposure to our justice systems, right? We know that, again, at least in the US, we tend to do a lot of harm. So I think that when we do risk need assessments, as I said earlier, we want to divert those low risk youth out, right? Let's use these assessments to say, leave this person alone, and not overserve them, not take them away from all of the positive stuff that's already going on in their life, and let them be. For our people that are assessed as moderate and higher risk, I think we want to use our assessments to determine the types of interventions that they need. And as I said, I think the default should always be staying in the community. We know effects are better when people are home, and that we put people into residential services or institutional services, only when necessary, only when there is not another option. And acknowledging that sometimes if someone has committed a very egregious crime, that there are other factors that come into play beyond, there are legal reasons, there are political reasons, there are public reasons for why decisions are made. But I think that we should use the assessments to minimize the harm that we do. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yes, a lot.
Perfect.
Con esta valiosa respuesta y opinión que nos ha dado la profesora Koetzle, damos por finalizada la primera jornada del 12º día de Conferencia Internacional Desafíos de la Seguridad en nuestras ciudades, gestión de los territorios para la prevención del delito y la violencia. Quiero agradecer a los dos expositores que nos acompañaron el día de hoy con las charlas magistrales. Han resultado muy valiosas y pertinentes para los desafíos que nuestro país enfrenta el día de hoy. Gracias también a todos quienes se conectaron. Esperamos que todo lo expuesto hoy les sea de gran utilidad. Los esperamos mañana desde las 9 en la segunda jornada, cuya temática será violencia y delincuencia en barrios y ciudades. Muchas gracias, cuídense mucho y hasta mañana.